The fluorescent lights in the empty office building flickered and hummed as I made my rounds at 2:15 in the morning, my footsteps echoing through corridors that had been bustling with activity just hours earlier, but now felt like the abandoned halls of some forgotten institution. And I thought I had gotten used to the eerie silence and the way shadows seemed to move just outside my peripheral vision. But tonight was different. Tonight, I could hear the soft clicking of computer keyboards coming from the third floor, the gentle tap, tap, tap of someone typing with purpose and concentration. Even though I had personally checked every office and confirmed that the building was completely empty before beginning my patrol. The sound was too rhythmic and deliberate to be explained by automatic systems or buildings settling, and when I climbed the stairs to investigate, the typing would stop the moment my footsteps became audible on the stairwell, only to resume once I had moved to a different part of the building. My name is Marcus, and that night taught me that the graveyard shift doesn't just mean working while others sleep. It means sharing your workplace with people who never clocked out, who died at their desks but continue showing up for work every night, typing reports that will never be read, and attending meetings that ended decades ago. Ever wondered why some office buildings feel wrong during overnight hours? Ever heard elevators moving between floors when you know you're the only living person in the building? Share this video if you've worked graveyard shifts and felt that creeping certainty that you weren't alone. Because tonight, I'm sharing 3 true accounts that will make you question who else might be working the night shift alongside you. These aren't exaggerated stories designed to make night shift workers paranoid about their jobs. These are real experiences from real people who learned that when you work while the world sleeps, you become witness to phenomena and encounters that most people never experience and would never believe if they were told about them. Jessica thought she understood hospital night shifts. As a registered nurse with over 5 years of experience, working overnight hours at a regional medical center in rural Pennsylvania, she was familiar with the unique challenges and rhythms of graveyard hospital work, the reduced staffing levels, the different types of medical emergencies that occurred during nighttime hours, and the eerie atmosphere that hospitals took on when most patients were sleeping. The medical center where Jessica worked was a modern facility built in the early 2000s with state-of-the-art equipment and contemporary amenities, but it was located on the site of a much older medical facility that had served the community for over a century before being demolished to make way for the new construction. The original hospital had been built in the 1890s and had served the area through 2 world wars, multiple epidemics, and countless personal tragedies and medical emergencies. Jessica's work as a night shift nurse typically involved monitoring patients in the intensive care unit, responding to emergency calls throughout the hospital, and providing care for patients who were admitted during overnight hours. The night shift staff was small but experienced, with nurses, doctors, and support personnel who had developed the close working relationships essential for providing quality medical care with limited resources. For over 5 years, Jessica's experience working night shifts had been professionally rewarding and personally manageable, with the kind of routine and predictability that allowed her to provide excellent patient care while maintaining her own health and well-being. Jessica had never experienced any unusual incidents that would make her question the safety or normalcy of her work environment. But Jessica's comfortable routine was challenged when she began to encounter patients and situations that defied medical explanation and challenged her understanding of how hospitals operated. The unusual incidents began when Jessica was assigned to care for a patient who had been admitted to the intensive care unit during the previous day shift, an elderly man who was recovering from surgery and was expected to have a routine recovery. The patient, who was listed in the hospital records as Thomas Mitchell, appeared to be a typical elderly surgical patient with the kind of medical history and current condition that Jessica had encountered hundreds of times during her nursing career. But as Jessica provided care for Mr. Mitchell during her overnight shifts, she began to notice aspects of his case that didn't match the medical records or the normal patterns of post-operative recovery. Mr. Mitchell's vital signs and medical responses were inconsistent with his documented medical history and current treatment plan, and his behavior and statements suggested that he was experiencing medical conditions and symptoms that were not reflected in his chart or acknowledged by the day shift staff who had been caring for him during regular hours. Hit that like button if you work in healthcare and have ever cared for patients who seem to know more about the hospital's history than its current operations. Because what Jessica discovered about Mr. Mitchell's true identity proved that some patients never really leave the places where they received their final medical care. Jessica's attempts to clarify Mr. Mitchell's medical status and treatment plan with other hospital staff were met with confusion and conflicting information that suggested there were significant gaps or errors in his medical records and care coordination. The situation became more puzzling when Jessica discovered that Mr. Mitchell's room was not included in the hospital's current patient census and that there was no record of his admission or current treatment in the hospital's computer system. Jessica's investigation of the discrepancy revealed that Mr. Mitchell's room number didn't correspond to any current patient assignment, and that the physical space where he was located didn't match the hospital's floor plan or room numbering system. Jessica's attempts to resolve the confusion were complicated by the fact that other night shift staff members seemed to be unaware of his presence in the hospital. The most disturbing aspect of Mr. Mitchell's case was his detailed knowledge of the hospital's history and the medical staff who had worked there over the decades, including information about doctors and nurses who had died years before Jessica began working at the facility, and events that had occurred during the hospital's earlier incarnation as the original 19th century medical facility. Mr. Mitchell would make references to medical procedures and patient cases from decades past, and he seemed to be more familiar with the hospital's historical operations than with its current medical practices and staff. Jessica's research into Mr. Mitchell's background and the hospital's history revealed that a patient named Thomas Mitchell had indeed been treated at the original hospital facility in 1987, where he had died during surgery due to complications that were considered unavoidable given the medical technology available at that time. The realization that she was providing nursing care for a patient who had died at the hospital decades before her birth created a level of confusion and terror that challenged Jessica's understanding of reality and her ability to function effectively as a healthcare professional. Jessica continued to provide care for Mr. Mitchell because her nursing training and professional ethics required her to respond to patients who needed medical attention, regardless of the circumstances. But Jessica's interactions with Mr. Mitchell became increasingly disturbing as he began to share information about other patients who had died at the hospital over the years, describing their medical conditions, their final moments, and their ongoing presence in the facility as spirits who continued to seek medical care and comfort from the living staff who worked in the building where they had spent their final hours. Mr. Mitchell's accounts of the hospital's spiritual population painted a picture of a medical facility that served both living and dead patients, with night shift staff unknowingly providing care for people who had died but had never really left the place where they had received their final medical treatment. Jessica ultimately transferred to day shift positions at different medical facilities to escape the overnight encounters with deceased patients that had made it impossible for her to work effectively during graveyard hours. Jessica's experience taught her that hospitals, as places where people experience their most vulnerable and final moments, can retain the spiritual presence of former patients who continue to seek care and comfort from medical staff. But if you think caring for deceased patients represents the most unsettling aspect of graveyard shift work, wait until you hear what Robert experienced at a Phoenix distribution center. Because sometimes the night shift means working alongside employees who died on the job, but never stopped showing up for work, continuing to process shipments and operate equipment in a supernatural version of their workplace that exists parallel to the world of the living. Robert was a warehouse worker in his late 20s who took a graveyard shift position at a large distribution center outside of Phoenix to earn extra money while attending community college during the day. The distribution center was a massive facility that processed and shipped consumer goods for a major retail chain. with automated systems and conveyor belts that operated around the clock to move merchandise from storage areas to loading docks. Robert's job involved monitoring the automated systems, performing quality control checks on shipments, and handling any problems or malfunctions that occurred during the overnight hours when the facility operated with minimal staffing and limited technical support. The distribution center was a modern facility built in the late 1990s, with high-tech automation systems, comprehensive security measures, and efficient design that maximized productivity while minimizing labor costs. The facility operated on a 24-hour schedule with different shifts handling different aspects of the distribution process, but the graveyard shift was the quietest and most automated, with most of the work being performed by computerized systems that required minimal human intervention under normal circumstances. For the first several months of his employment, Robert's graveyard shift work was exactly what he had expected: quiet, routine, and manageable work that allowed him to earn money while maintaining his academic schedule. Robert had never experienced any unusual incidents that would make him question the safety or normalcy of his work environment. But Robert's comfortable routine was disrupted when he began to notice that the facility's automated systems were exhibiting behaviors and patterns that didn't match their programmed operations and couldn't be explained by normal mechanical functions or computer programming. The unusual behaviors began with conveyor belts and sorting systems that would activate during periods when no shipments were scheduled and no merchandise was being processed. The automated systems would run through complete processing cycles, moving empty containers and activating sorting mechanisms as if they were handling actual merchandise shipments, but without any products or materials being processed through the system. The phantom operations would continue for extended periods, following the same patterns and timing as normal distribution activities, but without any actual work being performed. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you've ever worked in automated facilities where the machines seem to have a mind of their own. Because what Robert discovered about these phantom operations proved that some industrial accidents leave more than just safety records. They leave workers who continue their shifts long after their bodies have been removed from the building. Robert's investigation of the unusual system behaviors revealed that the automated equipment was responding to input signals and data that didn't correspond to any scheduled operations or programmed activities, suggesting that the systems were receiving instructions from sources that were not part of the facility's normal computer network or operational controls. The situation became more disturbing when Robert realized that the phantom operations were not random or meaningless, but were actually processing and moving merchandise that he couldn't see or detect using normal observation methods. The automated systems would behave exactly as they did when handling actual shipments, including weight sensors that registered loads, barcode scanners that recorded product information, and sorting mechanisms that directed items to specific destinations, but without any visible products being processed. Robert's attempts to understand and document the phantom operations were complicated by the fact that the facility's computer systems showed no record of the activities that he was observing, and that the automated equipment would return to normal idle status whenever supervisors or technical personnel were present to investigate his reports. The most unsettling aspect of the phantom operations was Robert's gradual realization that the invisible merchandise being processed by the automated systems corresponded to actual shipments that had been handled by the facility in the past, including products and orders that had been processed months or years earlier during the facility's operational history. Robert's research into the facility's operational history revealed that the phantom operations corresponded to shipments that had been processed during periods when the distribution center had experienced fatal accidents or serious injuries involving workers who had been killed or severely injured while working with the automated systems. The phantom operations seemed to be replaying the final work activities of employees who had died at the facility. The situation escalated when Robert began to see shadowy figures moving through the facility during the phantom operations' human-shaped forms that would operate equipment and move through the warehouse areas as if they were performing normal work activities, but without any physical substance or ability to interact with living personnel. The ghostly workers would follow the same routes and procedures that living employees used during normal operations, but they were visible only during the phantom operations and would disappear when the automated systems returned to idle status. Robert's interactions with the ghostly workers were limited but disturbing, as the spirits seemed to be unaware of his presence and continued to perform their work duties without acknowledging the passage of time or the fact that they had died years earlier. Robert ultimately quit his graveyard shift position at the distribution center and found different employment that did not involve working overnight hours in facilities where fatal accidents had occurred. Robert's experience taught him that industrial facilities where workers had died in accidents could retain the spiritual presence of former employees who continued to perform their work duties even after death. But even ghostly coworkers seem almost comforting compared to what Amanda experienced at a historic Savannah hotel. Because sometimes graveyard shift work means providing customer service to guests who checked in decades ago and never checked out, continuing to inhabit the rooms where they spent their final nights and expecting the same level of hospitality they received when they were among the living. Amanda was a hotel night auditor in her mid-20s who worked the graveyard shift at a historic hotel in downtown Savannah, Georgia, a facility that had been operating continuously since the 1920s and had served as a landmark accommodation for travelers, business people, and tourists visiting the historic city. Amanda's job involved managing the hotel's front desk during overnight hours, handling late arrivals and early departures, monitoring security systems, and performing the administrative tasks that kept the hotel operating smoothly during the quiet hours when most guests were sleeping and the daytime staff were off duty. The hotel was a beautiful example of 1920s architecture and design, with elegant furnishings, period details, and old-world charm that attracted guests who appreciated historic accommodations and the atmosphere of a bygone era. The building had been carefully maintained and periodically renovated to preserve its historic character while providing modern amenities and services. Amanda's work as a night auditor typically involved quiet periods of administrative work punctuated by occasional guest services and the routine security and maintenance checks that were necessary to ensure the hotel's safe and efficient operation during overnight hours. The graveyard shift was generally peaceful and manageable, with most guests sleeping soundly in their rooms. For the first year of her employment, Amanda's experience working graveyard shifts at the historic hotel was professionally satisfying and personally comfortable, with the kind of routine and predictability that allowed her to provide excellent guest service while enjoying the peaceful atmosphere and beautiful surroundings of the historic building. But Amanda's comfortable routine was disrupted when she began to encounter guests and situations that challenged her understanding of hotel operations and raised questions about the building's history and the nature of some of the people who stayed there during overnight hours. The unusual incidents began when Amanda started noticing guests who would appear in the lobby and common areas during the graveyard shift, but who were not registered in the hotel's computer system and had no record of checking in or making reservations for their stay. Ring that notification bell if you work in hospitality and have ever provided service to guests who seem to be from a different era entirely, because what Amanda discovered about these unregistered visitors proved that some hotels never really lose their guests. They just add them to a permanent registry that exists beyond the reach of modern computer systems. These unregistered guests would move through the hotel with familiarity and purpose, as if they were long-time residents who knew the building's layout and routines, but they would avoid direct interaction with Amanda and would disappear when she attempted to approach them or verify their guest status. The mysterious guests were dressed in clothing that seemed to belong to earlier eras, with styles and fashions that suggested they were from decades past. Amanda's attempts to identify and assist the mysterious guests were unsuccessful, as they would avoid her efforts to make contact and would seem to vanish into areas of the hotel that were not accessible to normal guests, or that didn't correspond to the building's current layout and room configuration. The situation became more puzzling when Amanda realized that the mysterious guests were not simply lost or confused contemporary visitors, but appeared to be former guests who had stayed at the hotel during earlier decades and had somehow remained in the building despite the passage of time and the changes that had occurred in the hotel's operations. Amanda's research into the hotel's history revealed that many of the mysterious guests she encountered matched descriptions and records of people who had stayed at the hotel during its earlier decades of operation, including business travelers, tourists, and local residents who had used the hotel for social events and extended stays. Some of the mysterious guests appeared to be people who had died while staying at the hotel, either from natural causes or accidents that had occurred during their visits to Savannah. The realization that she was encountering former guests who had died at the hotel but had never really left the building created a level of unease and confusion that challenged Amanda's ability to provide normal guest services and maintain her professional composure during the graveyard shift hours when the mysterious guests were most active. The mysterious guests were generally peaceful and non-threatening, but their presence created an atmosphere of supernatural activity that made it difficult for Amanda to distinguish between living guests who needed assistance and former guests who were simply continuing their eternal residence in the hotel. The situation became more complex when Amanda realized that some of the hotel's living guests were also aware of the mysterious former guests, and would sometimes report encounters or interactions that confirmed Amanda's observations about the building's supernatural population. Some living guests would mention seeing people in period clothing in the hallways or common areas, or would report conversations with other guests who seemed to be from different time periods. Amanda ultimately came to view the mysterious former guests as part of the hotel's historic character and charm, and she developed a professional approach to managing the supernatural aspects of her graveyard shift duties that allowed her to provide excellent service to living guests while respecting the ongoing presence of people who had made the hotel their permanent home during earlier eras. These three accounts from graveyard shift workers across America reveal a disturbing truth about working overnight hours. When you work while the world sleeps, you become witness to phenomena and encounters that most people never experience and would never believe if they were told about them. Jessica's encounters with deceased patients in Pennsylvania proved that hospitals can retain the spiritual presence of former patients who continue to seek medical care and comfort from night shift staff who work in the buildings where they spent their final hours. Robert's experience with ghostly workers in Arizona demonstrated that industrial facilities where workers have died in accidents can become supernatural workplaces where the deceased continue to perform their job duties alongside living employees who may be unaware of their ghostly coworkers' true nature. Amanda's interactions with former hotel guests in Georgia revealed that historic accommodations can harbor the spirits of people who died during their stays and continue to inhabit the rooms and common areas where they spent their final nights. The most chilling aspect of these accounts isn't the individual supernatural encounters themselves. It's the realization that graveyard shift workers across the country may be sharing their workplaces with people who died years or decades ago, but have never really left their jobs, their patients, or their favorite places to stay. Jessica had no warning that her nursing skills would be needed by patients who had died decades before her birth, but continued to seek medical care from living staff who worked in the hospital where they had received their final treatment. Robert had no indication that his warehouse duties would involve working alongside deceased employees who continued to process shipments and operate equipment in a ghostly version of their former workplace. Amanda had no clue that her hospitality training would need to include providing service to guests who had checked in during earlier decades and had never checked out, continuing to inhabit the hotel where they had spent their final days among the living. If you're currently working graveyard shifts or considering overnight employment, if you've ever felt that you weren't alone in places that should have been completely empty, or if you've encountered people or situations during overnight hours that didn't seem to belong to the current time, period, Trust your instincts and remember that the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead is thinnest during the hours when most people are asleep. Comment below if these stories have changed how you think about graveyard shift work. And remember that the next time you're working overnight hours, you might not be the only one on duty. You might be sharing your workplace with people who died at their jobs, but never stopped showing up for work, continuing to serve patients, process shipments, and welcome guests long after their earthly employment officially ended. Before you go, check out the playlist in the description for more true workplace horror stories that will change how you see overnight employment forever. Because in the end, the most unsettling realization isn't that these things happened. It's that they're still happening right now in hospitals, warehouses, and hotels across the country where graveyard shift workers are unknowingly providing their services alongside colleagues and serving customers who died years ago, but never really left their posts. Sweet dreams tonight, and remember, the next time you're working the graveyard shift and you hear footsteps in empty hallways, see lights in unoccupied rooms, or encounter people who seem to be from a different era entirely, ask yourself whether you're really alone on the job, or whether you're part of a workforce that includes employees who punched out decades ago but never stopped coming to work. Because sometimes the most dedicated workers are the ones who continue their duties long after their shifts were supposed to end, serving in a supernatural workplace where death is just another department transfer.